You know the sound a man makes when he doesn't get his way. It's not a shout. It's a sigh, a huff, the sound of a minor system in his world malfunctioning. For 35 years, I was the most reliable system in his world. And the night I finally shut down, all he could do was sigh at the inconvenience. Good evening, my dears. Come in, sit down. Get comfortable. I want to talk to you tonight about light. Not the grand, dazzling kind, but the small, steady kind. The kind you leave on for someone. For years. Until one day, you realize you've been sitting in the dark for a very, very long time. They call this a marriage story. I call it an awakening. And it all started, with a switch by a door. It began as a soft thing. Isn't that how most things that last begin? Not with a bang or a grand pronouncement but with a gentle almost instinctual movement of the heart. The porch light was not my idea originally. It was his mother's. In that big old house where he grew up she would always leave the hall light burning a small vigil against the night when he was out as a boy. He told me that story early on, his voice touched with a sweetness of vulnerability I would rarely hear again. He said it made him feel cherished. He said it made the dark feel less deep. So when we moved into our own house, a modest ranch with a plain glass fixture by the front door, I remembered. I wanted to be the source of that feeling for him. I wanted to be his soft place to land. The first time I did it he was working late on his dissertation. The house felt too big and empty, the silence a presence all its own. I went to bed but I couldn't sleep. I got up and paced. And then I saw it. That switch by the door. A simple toggle of white plastic. I flipped it. A warm yellow glow spilled out onto the front steps and part of the walkway. It cut a clean, friendly path through the blackness. It looked like hope. It felt like a prayer. When his car pulled up an hour later I heard his footsteps pause on the walk. He came inside and his face was open. He looked at me, not past me. He took my hands in his. They were cold from the night air. He said thank you. He said it felt like you were out there waiting for me. He said that light felt like your hand reaching out to guide me home. That was the promise. That was the covenant. The light was not merely a bulb in a socket. It was my presence. It was my steady, unwavering thought of him. It was a tangible thread spun from my care, stretched across the distance between his world and mine. When he was under that light he was under my gaze. He was held in my consciousness. I was saying, I am here. I am thinking of you. Your journey matters to me. Your safe return is my concern. Come back to me. I am waiting. And for a handful of years it remained that sacred. It was our quiet ritual. He would kiss me goodbye in the morning and sometimes whisper, leave the light on for me tonight. And I would nod, feeling chosen, feeling essential. That phrase, leave the light on, became our shorthand for I love you, I am thinking of you, I anticipate your return. It was more intimate than the words themselves. It was an action, a prepared space, a curated welcome. It was the opposite of neglect. It was proactive devotion. I would perform the ceremony as dusk began to bleed into the sky. I would stand at the door and look out at the world he was in. I would think about him grading papers in a fluorescent-lit office or driving through gathering shadows. And I would reach up and click the switch. The sound was firm and final. A decision made. A commitment upheld. My beacon is lit. Your way is clear. I am here. He would come home and his shoulders would drop a fraction the moment that light washed over his car. I could see it from the window. A visible relaxation. He was entering a sphere I had charged with intention. He was crossing a boundary from the world of demands and performance into a world of reception. He was seen not for what he could produce but simply for being himself, coming home. He would walk in and often before he even took off his coat he would find me. He would rest his forehead against mine. He would smell of outside and exhaust and coffee. He would say, I saw the light from the corner. It made the last mile easier. We built a whole mythology around that small circle of illumination. On stormy nights I would say, the light's on, it will guide you through the rain. When he was anxious about a meeting I would say, just think of the light on the porch waiting. It became our anchor. It was a fixed point in the chaos of life. No matter what happened out there in the world, that light, and by extension I would be constant. I would be reliable. I would be the keeper of the flame. I believed in that promise with my whole being. I knitted it into the fabric of our marriage. I saw it as my sacred duty, my joyful privilege. To be the one who held the light. To be the keeper of the welcome. It made me feel strong and necessary. It gave my love a daily action of physical manifestation. My love was not just a feeling, it was a light burning against the darkness. It was a practical, durable thing. I did not see then the subtle shift, the slow transfer of ownership. Because when you make a promise that beautiful, you never imagine the day it might become a chain. You don't foresee the moment when the ritual loses its soul and becomes mere routine. The light was my gift. But a gift given every day without fail, without question, can start to look like a permanent fixture. A part of the landscape. An entitlement. The first time he didn't mention it, I brushed it off. He'd had a hard day. He was distracted. The second and third time a little knot of disappointment formed in my stomach, but I silenced it. I told myself I was being childish, needing praise for a simple act of love. But love feeds on acknowledgement. It withers under assumption. The light remained the same warm yellow, the same circle on the walk. But the silence when he came in grew heavier. The thank yous became scarce, then extinct. The forehead touch was replaced by a distracted peck on the cheek. His eyes already looking past me to the mail on the table. The promise was still there in my heart. I still performed it with the same intention for a long, long time. But I was now the only one speaking that language. I was casting a line out into the night, but no one was on the other end to tug back. The thread of connection I felt so strongly had gone slack. I kept lighting the beacon, but the ship seemed to have forgotten it was guiding him home. He sailed right past it into his own harbors of thought and worry and distraction. And yet I clung to the promise. I thought if I just kept being constant, if I just kept the faith of that light, he would remember. He would see it again and feel what he used to feel. The promise became a hope, then a plea, then a prison of my own making. Because I had promised. I had said I would leave the light on. And a promise is a promise. Even when the person you made it to has forgotten it exists. Even when the meaning has drained out of it like color from an old photograph. You are left with the hollow shell of the action. The empty click of the switch. The glow that illuminates nothing but your own solitude. The promise of the light was pure. It was one of the truest things I ever offered. And its slow betrayal was not in its extinguishing, but in its becoming invisible. The greatest heartbreak is not when someone blows out your flame. It is when they simply stop seeing that it's burning. They walk through its warmth every single day and never once feel its heat. It was a fade so slow you would not notice it if you lived it day to day. You would have to step back years to see the contrast. You would need the vision of a ghost hovering above the decades to witness the exact moment the gold turned to lead. The shift was not in the light itself. The bulb gave the same steady wattage. The glass fixture gathered the same moths on summer nights. The difference was in the air around it. The difference was in the weight of the hand that flipped the switch. The difference was in the silence that greeted its glow. It began with the unremarkable language of a shared life. A muttered "I'll be late." A note on the fridge. A phone call just before 5. The reasons were always valid, always logical. A department meeting running over. Traffic on the bridge. He had to help a student. Then the reasons grew broader, more elusive. Networking events. Drinks with colleagues from his alma mater. A sudden need to work undisturbed at the campus library. The space between his world and mine began to stretch. The thread of light had to span a greater distance. I would stand at the window watching the street. Earlier his headlights would appear by 8:15, then 8:45, then 9:30. The pool of light on the empty porch seemed to grow wider, emptier, more patient. It was waiting for a shadow that took longer and longer to arrive. I made excuses for him. A man must build his career. A professor must be available. I was proud of his dedication. I told myself this was the season of building. We were laying the foundation for our future. The light was my contribution to that foundation. It was my part of the work. Holding the space. Keeping the home fires burning. An old-fashioned term, but it felt true. I was tending the hearth. The light was the modern equivalent of a fire in the grate, a signal of warmth and sustenance within. It was my job. And that is the precise point where the beacon became a burden. The moment an act of free-flowing love gets categorized as a job. A duty. A role. The poetry leaks out of it. What was once a song becomes a checklist. He stopped seeing the love and started relying on the result. The result was a lit porch, a warm meal, a quiet house. The love was the why behind it all. But the why got lost. It got buried under the routine of it. I remember the first time I forgot. Not truly forgot, but I was absorbed in a book, a novel that carried me away to another century. Dusk fell and the room grew dim and I kept reading. His car pulled into the drive. The sound of the engine jolted me back. I looked up and saw the dark porch through the window. A jolt of panic, pure and animal, went through me. I had failed. I scrambled up, my book tumbling to the floor, and I hit the switch just as his key turned in the lock. The light came on a second after he was already inside. He blinked in the sudden brightness. He looked at me, flushed and flustered, in the hallway. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Nothing," I said, catching my breath. "I just lost track of time." He shook his head, a faint smile that wasn't kind. "You had me worried for a second. Thought the power was out." He hung up his coat and walked past me. There was no warmth in his voice. No memory of what that light had meant. There was only the observation of a potential household glitch avoided. My panic had not been about missing him or failing our connection. My panic was about failing a task. Disrupting the system. In that moment I saw myself through his eyes, not as a lover keeping a vigil, but as a functionary who had neglected a key responsibility. The system had a hiccup. It was corrected. He moved on. After that I became vigilant. I set an alarm in my mind for dusk. I would be in the middle of cooking and I would stop, wipe my hands and go to the door. Click. Back to the stove. It became a mechanical act. A pivot in my daily dance. The intention I would pour into it became thinner each time. Instead of "I am thinking of you, I am lighting a path home," the thought became "I must do this or he will notice it is not done." His appreciation didn't just fade, it transformed. It became an expectation so deep it was silent. He no longer thanked me for the light. He would only comment on its absence. And his comments were never about missing the sentiment. They were about inconvenience. "Can't see the step. Almost tripped. Why is it so dark out here?" The light was now a utility. Like running water or electricity. It was a baseline condition of his comfort. And I was the maintenance crew. The burden grew heavier because it was invisible to him. He carried none of its weight. He never wondered if I was tired of the ritual. He never considered offering to do it himself. He never once on a day when I was sick or had a headache said, "You stay in bed, I'll get the light." That never occurred to him. Because in his mind it wasn't my act of love. It was my appointed task. Like my name was on a mental chore chart next to that particular duty. Evelyn, porch light. The real weight wasn't in the finger's motion on the switch. The weight was in the symbolism. That small action came to represent every unacknowledged labor of my life. The planning of meals, the remembering of birthdays, the emotional monitoring of our daughter, the keeping of the social calendar, the soothing of his worries, the listening. The light was the perfect metaphor because it was so visible yet its meaning was utterly unseen. I was performing a visible act of care that had become invisible in its significance. I was shouting a message of love in a language he had forgotten how to hear. I began to resent the fixture itself. That plain glass dome. I would clean it and feel a bitterness rise in my throat. I changed the bulb with a sharp twist of my wrist. Sometimes I wished it would just burn out. A clean break. An external reason to stop. But it was a reliable bulb. It lasted for years. Its very reliability mocked me. It was more reliable than the feeling it was supposed to represent. The burden became a kind of lonely prison. I was the warden and the inmate. I held the key but felt locked in by my own promise, by my own nature as a person who follows through. To stop would be to make a statement. To cause a ripple. And for so long I was not ready for the ripple. I preferred the heavy quiet of the burden to the noisy uncertainty of its removal. The known weight was easier than the unknown void. So I carried it. Year after year, the click of the switch became the sound of my own resignation. The glow on the porch was not a welcome anymore. It was the footprint of my obligation. It was the evidence of my continued participation in a contract where the terms had changed but the signatures were never updated. I was working from an old job description for a position that no longer existed in his heart. The beacon had been a signal between two people. The burden was a monologue. A nightly repetition of a message sent out into a void. And you know what happens when you speak into a void long enough. You start to doubt the sound of your own voice. You start to wonder if you are even speaking at all. The light was still on. But I was the one fading. I was becoming a ghost in my own ritual, turning transparent with the effort of maintaining a glow for someone who had long since stopped looking for it. You build a life together, board by board, nail by nail. You think you are constructing a shelter, a shared space. You do not realize you are also building the walls of your own disappearance. The architecture of invisibility is not erected with malice. It is crafted slowly with the soft materials of routine and expectation. It is painted in the neutral colors of familiarity. One day you look up and you are perfectly integrated into the structure. You are the wallpaper. You are the floorboards that never creak. You are the comfortable chair in the corner. You are essential to the form and function of the place, and you are utterly unseen. I was the atmosphere in that house. Necessary, ever present, and completely unnoticed. Like the air he breathed. He never stopped to think about the air unless it grew thin or foul. My presence was the condition of his comfort. My labor was the silent engine of his daily life. He would wake to the smell of coffee because I had set the timer. The newspaper would be on the kitchen table dry because I had brought it in from the porch. His favorite mug would be clean and waiting. These were not acts he witnessed. They were simply facts of his waking world. The sun rises. The coffee is hot. Evelyn is here. I was the functionary of his well-being. I managed the delicate ecosystem of the home. I knew when the furnace filter needed changing. I heard the first faint drip of the leaking faucet he would never notice. I kept the calendar in my mind, a living scroll of obligations and dates. His mother's doctor appointment next Thursday. The dinner party for his department head in 2 weeks, needing a grocery list and a thorough cleaning of the dining room. Our daughter Maya's school play requiring an early departure from work and a bouquet of flowers after. These things existed in my consciousness as a low hum of constant preparation. They did not exist in his until the moment they occurred. Then he would participate fully, graciously. He would charm his mother's doctor. He would pour wine for his colleagues and receive compliments on our home. He would applaud wildly for Maya and present the flowers with a flourish. He inhabited the events I built. He enjoyed the fruits of my foresight. The planning, the scaffolding, the countless invisible steps that led to that moment were my domain. A domain of ghosts. He saw the results. He never saw the process. The result was a tidy house. The process was the quiet hour of my Saturday while he read the sports section. The result was a delicious meal. The process was the recipe research, the shopping list made around sales, the chopping and stirring while listening to the news alone in the kitchen. The result was his crisp shirt. The process was the sorting, the stain treatment, the precise timing of the iron before the fabric cooled. I was the curator of results. My own hands, my own time, my own mental energy were the tools kept in the dark workshop out back. He talked at me, not with me. He would recount his day, the politics of his department, the clever thing he said in a meeting. I would listen. I would nod. I would ask the prompting question. And when he was done, spent from the download, he would settle into his chair. The exchange was complete. He had transferred his narrative. My role was receptacle. When I would begin to speak of my day, the funny thing the cashier said, the concerning article one read, the small anxiety about Maya, he would listen with a polite, distant look. His eyes would flicker to the newspaper. He would say, "That's nice," or "I'm sure it's fine." The conversation would land like a feather on stone and skitter away. My narrative was not absorbed. It was not fuel for a mutual dialogue. It was ambient sound, the hum of the refrigerator. My body became furniture. He would reach around me to get a glass from the cabinet. He would brush past me in the hallway without a word. My physical self was an obstacle to be navigated, not a person to be touched. Our intimate life followed the same architecture. It was a scheduled maintenance of the marital structure, a quiet functional duty. It was not a meeting of two unseen souls. It was another result produced, another need managed, another silent brick in the wall. The greatest trick of the architecture is that it makes you doubt your own solidity. When you are reflected in no one's eyes, when your words find no purchase, when your efforts leave no discernible mark, you begin to feel spectral. You look at your own hands and wonder if they are truly capable of lifting anything of weight. You speak and the sound of your voice seems thin even to yourself. You have a thought and you think, who cares? Where would this thought go if I released it? It would bounce off the walls of this well-built invisible house and fall dead to the floor. I would try sometimes to point to the architecture. A gentle probing. Do you ever feel like we just move past each other? He would frown not with anger but with genuine confusion. What do you mean? We live together. We have dinner. We're fine. He would pat my hand. The pat was dismissive. It was the pat you give to a child who has imagined a monster under the bed. There. The house is sound. Nothing is wrong. Go back to sleep. His assurance was the most isolating thing of all. Because it proved he did not just fail to see me. He failed to see the entire structure that made his comfort possible. He lived in a palace and thought it grew from the ground. He never imagined the countless hands that laid the stone. And my hands had become so smooth from the work they left no fingerprints. I existed in the negative space. In what was not said. In what was not needed. In the problems that never reached him because I intercepted them. A flat tire. A sick pet. A threatening letter from a bill collector that was actually a mistake. I handled these things. I presented him with a world that was smooth and manageable. And in smoothing the world for him I sanded down my own edges. I made myself frictionless, easy to overlook, a surface upon which his life could slide without effort. The porch light was the perfect symbol because it was the one visible part of my labor he had to physically confront. And even that he had ceased to see as labor. He saw it as a condition like gravity. The light is on because it is night. Evelyn is here because this is home. There was no causality in his mind that connected his comfort to my continuous conscious choice. I was not a person making choices. I was a facet of his environment. As predictable as the sunrise. As unremarkable as the grass. This architecture is so sturdy because it is built with your own complicity. You lay the bricks yourself. You think you are building a home, a partnership. You are building his sanctuary. And with every silent accommodation, every unasked for solution, every swallowed comment, you add another layer to the wall that finally encloses you. You become the ghost in the machine you built. The machine hums along beautifully. It produces comfort and ease and a lovely quiet life. And you wander its halls whispering, but the walls are too thick and the machine's hum is too loud and no one hears you at all. You are the soul of the place and the place has no need for a soul. It only needs to function. And you, my dear, have made it function perfectly. You have made yourself obsolete in your own life. A quiet curator of a museum where you are the only visitor. There was no lightning strike. No letter discovered. No raised voice heard through a closed door. The world did not crack open with a sound. It was a Tuesday. A common Tuesday with a common rain. The kind of rain that seems less like weather and more like a mood, a gray and patient melancholy seeping into the very brick of the house. I had done the common things. I had pushed the cart through the bright aisles of the grocery store, a silent ballet of selection and consideration. I had unloaded the bags onto the counter, each item finding its place with a soft thud. I had made a pot of soup, chopping onions, carrots, celery, the knife on the board, a steady familiar rhythm. I had paid the electric bill online, the click of the mouse, a tiny digital submission to the machinery of modern life. It was a day of small submissions. Dusk came early, swallowed by the rain. It was not a dramatic sunset. There was no gold or purple. The light simply faded from the world like a lamp being slowly dimmed. The room where I sat grew soft at the edges. I looked up from the mending in my lap, a shirt of his with a loose button. My hands had been moving without my mind. A needle pulling thread through cotton, a tiny act of repair. My body knew the time. My bones, my blood, they had set their own clock to this ritual. As the last of the gray light bled away, my body began its old familiar pilgrimage. My legs tensed to stand. My weight shifted forward in the chair. My spine straightened for the walk to the door. It was a physiological response deeper than thought, carved into my muscles by 12,000 repetitions. But on this Tuesday my mind, which had been a silent passenger for so long, spoke. It did not shout. It simply asked a question. A single clear sentence that hung in the damp air of the room. Why? The word was so simple. A child's word. It stopped me. My body, half risen, hovered there, suspended between sitting and standing. Why? I looked across the room at the front door. I could see the switch from where I was, a small pale smudge against the wall. Why'd I cross this room? Why'd I lift my hand? Why'd I perform this tiny ceremony for an empty porch, for a man who would not notice its absence until it became a personal inconvenience? The question unraveled everything. It was not just about the light. The why was a thread and I pulled it. Why'd I make this soup he will eat without tasting? Why'd I mend this shirt for a man who would not see the tear nor the repair? Why'd I exist in this house as a function? Why have I consented to be the atmosphere? My legs gave way and I sat back down. The mending slid from my lap to the floor, a soft heap of cloth and thread. I did not pick it up. I looked at my hands resting on my knees. They were capable hands. They had held a child, mixed cakes, planted flowers, soothed fevers, written letters. They were not only tools for service. They were instruments of a life. My life. I made a decision then. Not a grand decision. A very small one. I decided not to get up. I decided not to cross the room. I decided not to lift my hand. I decided to break the chain of my own conditioning link by silent link. I would sit. I would let the dark come. I would see what it felt like. And so I sat. I watched as the shapes in the room, my reading lamp, the arm of the sofa, the picture frame on the wall, dissolved into shadows. The rain ticked against the window. The house settled into its own sounds, the creak of a pipe, the faint sigh of the furnace. I was part of the darkening room. I was not fighting it. I was letting it hold me. It felt quiet, not peaceful, not yet, but quiet, a massive hollow quiet, like the silence in the wake of a constant noise you only just realized was there. The noise had been my own relentless doing, my own constant maintenance of the world around him, and now I had stopped. Just this one thing, just this small pivot, but in the stopping the noise ceased and the quiet rushed in. I thought of nothing grand. I did not think of liberation or awakening. I thought of practical things. I thought the soup might need a little more salt. I thought I should call Maya tomorrow. I thought my back ached from sitting so still. My mind was my own again. It was not preparing a space for someone else's arrival. It was simply occupying the space I was in. Then I heard his car. The wet crunch of tires on gravel. The engine cutting off. A car door shutting. The sequence was as familiar as my own heartbeat. I did not move. I turned my head slowly and looked out the window. I saw him. An umbrella bloomed black against the gray. He took 2 steps toward the house on the wet walk. And he stopped. He stood there under the drizzle and he looked up. He looked at the porch, at the dark glass fixture. His head tilted just a fraction. A puzzle. A minor error in his expected reality. I saw his body react. Not with concern but with irritation. A slight hunch of the shoulders, a tightening in the line of his jaw. The dark porch was a pebble in his shoe. He looked down, fumbled in his pocket for his keys. His movements were clumsier in the poor light. He muttered something to himself, a cloud of breath in the damp air. He was not thinking of me. He was not wondering if I was unwell or sad or gone. He was thinking of the bulb. The faulty bulb. The broken thing. He found the key, struggled with the lock and pushed the door open. He stood silhouetted in the doorway, a dark shape against the darker hallway. Evelyn. His voice was not a call of love. It was an announcement of a problem. The bulb's out on the porch. I almost tripped. You didn't notice. The question hung in the air. You didn't notice. It was the entirety of our marriage in one phrase. He assumed the world fell into 2 categories, things he noticed and managed and things I noticed and managed. The porch light was in my category. It had malfunctioned. I had failed to report it. I had failed to fix it. This was the scope of the crisis. I did not answer. I let his words sit in the dark room between us. I let him feel the absence of my immediate response, the absence of my flutter of apology, my quick movement to solve it. I gave him only silence. He flicked the hallway switch. Harsh light flooded the hall and spilled into the living room, making us both blink. He saw me, then really saw me for the first time that evening, sitting still in my chair surrounded by the soft dark. "Why are you sitting in the dark?" he asked. The irritation was clearer now. 2 problems. A dark porch and a wife sitting in the dark. Both were irregularities. Both required correction. I looked at him. I saw the confusion on his face, the genuine bewilderment that the systems of his evening were out of order. I felt a strange calm. The calm of diagnosis. The final undeniable symptom had just presented itself. "I'm just sitting," I said. My voice was steady. It did not apologize. It did not explain. He shook his head, a quick frustrated motion. "Well, you need to call someone tomorrow. Or I'll pick up a bulb." He said it as if giving a directive to a slightly incompetent subordinate. Problem identified. Solution delegated. Order restored. He walked past me, his damp coat brushing against the side of my chair. He was already moving toward the kitchen, toward the next thing. Is there any of that soup left? In that moment the tiny quiet click I had felt inside earlier became a definitive lock. A vault door sealing shut. His universe was one of tasks and repairs. My inner world, my quiet rebellion, my profound question of why was not even a speck on the map of that universe. It did not compute. I was sitting in the dark because I had chosen to. That was an idea with no language in his world. Yes, I said, my voice still calm. The soup is on the stove. He nodded, satisfied. The systems were coming back online. Soup was available. The bulb would be replaced. The wife in the chair was an anomaly he would now forget. But I would not forget. That Tuesday was my line in the sand. Or rather my line in the shadow. I had chosen the dark. And in choosing it I had seen with perfect terrible clarity the landscape I had been living in. It was not a landscape of love. It was a landscape of function. And I had just resigned from my post. The rain continued to fall. He ate his soup at the kitchen table reading the paper. I sat in my chair in the living room. The distance between us was no longer just feet and furniture. It was a chasm of understanding. A vast silent space where my why echoed with no hope of an answer. He would never ask why. He would only ever ask how to fix the bulb. And some things, my dear, cannot be fixed. They can only be acknowledged. And when they are not acknowledged they become the quiet solid ground upon which you finally decide to walk away. That Tuesday I stopped waiting for him to see me. And in that cessation I began for the first time in 35 years to see myself. It was a devastation of such quiet order it could be mistaken for nothing at all. There was no storm, no slammed door, no shattered glass. The devastation was in the vocabulary he used. It was in the complete and total failure of his imagination to travel the short impossible distance from a burnt-out bulb to a burnt-out heart. I had prepared for many things over the years. I had prepared for his anger, which was rare and cold. I had prepared for his dismissal, which was more common and soft, like being buried in dry sand. I had not prepared for this. For the sheer mundane simplicity of his blindness. It was an innocence so profound it felt violent. He stood in the hallway dripping rainwater onto the rug. The harsh overhead light carved shadows under his eyes. His face was not concerned. It was inconvenienced. He was a man whose train had been delayed. Whose coffee had gone cold. The object of his frustration was not the darkness of the world or the loneliness of his wife sitting within it. The object was the fixture. The glass and the filament. The tangible broken thing. His mind, a practical orderly machine, moved immediately to logistics. To supply chains. To the delegation of repair. His universe was one of cause and effect, and this was a simple effect with a simple cause. A dead bulb. A wife who had not yet made the call. You didn't notice. The question was not an accusation of emotional neglect. It was an accusation of poor household management. It assumed my role was one of perpetual surveillance of the physical domain. My failure was one of observation. I had missed a visual cue. It was a professional oversight. When I did not answer he turned on the hall light. The action was not to see me better. It was to solve the immediate problem of his own navigation. To banish the shadow at his feet. The light, when it came, was a shock. It was the wrong kind of light. It was the light of an interrogation room or a hospital corridor. It exposed, but it did not illuminate. It showed the facts of the scene, a woman in a chair, a room growing dark, but it revealed nothing of the truth. And in that stark exposure he saw only the next irregularity. Why are you sitting in the dark? This was a second managerial failure. The proper state of a living room at this hour was lit. I had allowed an improper state to persist. Two faults now, a dark porch and a dark wife. Both required correction. His tone held no warmth. No thread of "Are you unwell? Are you sad? Have I done something?" It held the mild exasperation of a person dealing with a series of small preventable annoyances. His mind was a list. Call electrician. Buy bulb. Check wife. The items were of equal weight. They were tasks to be checked off to restore the evening to its proper smooth course. I said, "I'm just sitting." My words were a stone dropped into a deep well. I listened for the splash. There was none. The well was not deep. It was shallow and dry. My statement did not register as communication. It registered as noise, an irrelevant sound between the problem and the solution. His response was the pivot point of my entire life. Well, you need to call someone tomorrow. Or I'll pick up a bulb. There it was, the entirety of his understanding. The boundary of his perception. The problem was external and mechanical. The solution was external and mechanical. The woman was the means to the solution or an obstacle to it. In this moment I was an obstacle. I had not performed the preliminary task of identifying the problem. So he would handle it. He would buy the bulb. He would restore the light. He would fix my oversight. This was his magnanimity, his taking charge. He did not wait for my agreement. He did not seek my eyes to see what might dwell there behind the calm. He walked past me. His coat brushed my chair. He brought the smell of wet wool and outside into my space. It was an invasion not of malice but of utter disregard. I was part of the furniture in the path between the problem and the soup. The soup, which was the next item on the list. Is there any of that soup left? This was the devastation, the seamless unbroken continuity of his own needs. The light was out. That was a problem for his comfort. The wife was in the dark. That was a curiosity briefly noted. The soup was the next requirement. His mind flowed from one to the next without a ripple, without a shudder, without a single question that connected these dots into a picture of a human being in quiet crisis. In his world there was no connection between a porch light and a soul. No symbolic thread, no metaphor. A light was a light. A wife was a wife. Soup was soup. Each existed in its own sealed category. Love did not enter into it. Love was an abstract, perhaps a memory, a background condition like the weather. It was not an active living current that could be dimmed or severed. He did not speak the language of symbols. He spoke the language of facts. And the facts were that he was home, he was wet, he was hungry, and the mechanisms of his home were not all functioning at optimal capacity. My silence in the face of his reaction was not a strategy. It was a physiological response. My voice, my words, my explanations were suddenly foreign currencies in a land that only traded in utility. There was no way to say I am sitting in the dark because the light inside me has gone out. That sentence would sound like madness to him. Poetry or psychosis. Not a fact. Not a thing to be fixed with a bulb from the hardware store. He ate his soup at the kitchen table. I heard the clink of his spoon against the bowl. I heard the rustle of his newspaper. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary Tuesday. This was the true horror. That my internal earthquake registered on no Richter scale in that house. The plates of my spirit had shifted. A continent of feeling had broken off and sunk into the sea. And in the kitchen a man drank his soup and turned a page. His reaction, or rather his profound non-reaction, was the most clarifying moment of my life. It was the answer to every unasked question. It was the proof. For years I had nursed a secret fragile hope that deep down he knew. That he sensed the distance, the loneliness. That he was simply afraid to address it. That his silence was a mirror of my own. A shared inability to bridge the gap. But this was not silence. This was emptiness. His confusion was not over a marital rift. It was over a logistical snag. His irritation was not at a breaking heart but at a broken routine. There was no deep down. The surface was all there was. A smooth plane of habit and expectation. I had been speaking sonnets to a man who only understood grocery lists. And I had mistaken his quiet acceptance of my presence for understanding. It was not understanding. It was convenience. The devastation was in its absolute banality. There was no drama to point to. No cruel word to replay. Only a man confused by a dark porch and a wife who had not yet called for its repair. How could I ever explain the depth of this wound? It was a puncture made by nothing. By absence. By the lack of a single empathetic thought. The injury was so clean it was invisible. There was no bruise to show. No mark upon my skin. Only a perfect hollow place inside where the hope of being seen had finally evaporated, leaving behind a cold, dry certainty. He came to bed later. He settled in with a sigh. Just before he turned out his lamp he said, "Don't forget to call about that bulb tomorrow." It was the last word on the subject. The final instruction. Then the room went dark and within minutes his breathing deepened into sleep. I lay awake beside him in the marital bed. The space between us felt vast. An unbridgeable chasm of different realities. In his reality a task needed doing. In my reality a life had just ended. The life of the woman who believed her quiet suffering was somehow felt. The woman who believed her invisible labor was somehow known. The woman who thought if she just kept the light on a little longer, kept the soup warm, kept the silence, he might one day look up and truly see the source of all that comfort. That woman died on that rainy Tuesday. Not with a whimper but with the sound of a spoon clinking against a bowl. The most ordinary sound in the world. The sound of a man eating his soup completely unaware that he was dining in the ruins of a marriage. His reaction was not a failure to fight for me. It was a failure to notice there was anything to fight for. And that my dear is a devastation from which there is no coming back. It is the quietest, most final verdict a woman can receive. You were not just alone. You were not even part of the equation. The power was not in the slamming of the door. It was in the not slamming it. It was in the quiet click of the latch engaging behind me, a sound so soft it was almost swallowed by the hum of the departing cab. My power was not in what I said. It was in what I finally chose not to say. For 35 years I had spoken a language of service, a dialect of care. I had explained, I had reminded, I had soothed. My voice had been a tool for his comfort. Now my silence became a territory all my own. A vast quiet country where I was the only citizen and the only law. I did not explain. Explanation is a bridge you build to someone on the other side of a misunderstanding. We were not separated by a misunderstanding. We were separated by a chasm of different realities. He lived in a world of objects and tasks. I had just discovered I lived in a world of spirit and symbols. There were no words in his vocabulary for what I felt. My pain would have sounded to him like a recitation of trivialities. A dark porch, an unasked question, a bowl of soup. How could I build a bridge from these pebbles? They were not pebbles to me. They were the stones of my altar, worn smooth from decades of kneeling. To explain would have been to once again perform labor for him. The emotional labor of translating my heart into a ledger he could dismiss as unbalanced. I was done with ledgers. My silence was not a punishment. Punishment implies a desire to inflict pain to correct a behavior. I had no such desire. The desire itself had died that Tuesday night listening to the clink of his spoon. My silence was simply the truth. The truth had no words he would recognize. The truth was a color he was blind to. So I stopped trying to paint the picture. I let the canvas go blank. When he would ask with growing frustration why I hadn't called about the bulb, why I was out so often, why my eyes seemed focused on some distant point, I would simply say, I'm handling it, or, I was out, or, I'm just thinking. Answers that were factual and empty. Walls of polite nothing. He would huff and turn away unsatisfied. He wanted a fight. He wanted tears. He wanted the familiar landscape of a minor marital dispute where he could argue his point, defend his logic, and ultimately pardon me for my emotionality. He was braced for a storm. My calm sunlit silence disarmed him completely. There was nothing to grab onto. No accusation to refute. No emotion to soothe or dismiss. There was only my quiet absence even as I stood in the same room. I began the real work then. The internal work. The work of unstitching my identity from the fabric of his life. It was meticulous and slow. I did not make grand declarations. I made small silent choices. I signed up for a pottery class not because I loved clay but because the act of centering it on the wheel required a focus that pushed every other thought from my mind. In that focus I found a silence within the silence. A productive, peaceful void. My hands learned a new language, the language of shape and pressure. They were no longer just tools for his world. They were creators of my own. I had lunch with Diane. We talked of novels and the strange dreams we had and the way the light fell in her garden in the late afternoon. The conversation meandered. It was not efficient. It served no purpose other than the joy of connection. I laughed with her. The sound of my own laugh startled me at first. It was a muscle long unused. But it was mine. It came from my center, not from a place of accommodation. I would come home sometimes to find him sitting. Just sitting. The television a blue flicker he wasn't watching. He would look at me as I came in and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes that was not irritation. It was confusion. The system was not behaving as it should. The reliable component was operating on a new unpredictable rhythm. He was noticing the gaps. The empty space where my predictable presence used to be. He was not missing me. He was missing the function I had performed. The silence where my chatter used to be was loud to him. "You're out a lot lately." It was an accusation wrapped in observation. "I am," I said. 2 words. A simple truth. I offered no defense, no itinerary. I hung up my coat and walked into the kitchen to pour a glass of water. The power was in the lack of justification. I was not seeking his permission. I was reporting a fact of my existence as casually as he might report the weather. My leaving began long before I packed the suitcase. It began in those moments. It was a leaving of expectation. A leaving of the need for his understanding or even his acknowledgement. I was transferring my citizenship from the country of us to the country of me. The border was silent and patrolled by my own resolve. When I finally told him I was leaving, the physical act was an afterthought. The real departure had already happened. I had already left the marriage in my heart. The paperwork, the moving of belongings, those were just legal and logistical echoes of a journey already completed. So when I stood in the doorway of his study, my single suitcase by the front door, my voice was calm. There was no tremor, no crack. The earthquake was over. This was the quiet landscape after. His reaction was a spectacle of delayed shock. The sputtering, the demands, the wounded whys. It was noise. It was the sound of the system finally registering a catastrophic failure. But I was no longer part of that system. I was an observer. His confusion was genuine. His pain was real, but it was the pain of a man who has lost his favorite armchair, not the pain of a man who has lost his love. He was grieving the disruption of his habitat. My silence held. I let his words wash over me. I did not absorb them. I did not collect them to hurt myself with later. They were his words from his world. They had no power in mine. When he finally exhausted himself and asked the plaintive desperate, "What did I do?" I gave him my final truth. "You didn't have to do anything, Robert. You just had to see." It was not an accusation. It was an epitaph. It was the simple, profound reason carved on the headstone of our marriage. His failure was not one of action but of perception. A sin of omission so total it erased the world I lived in. I walked out. I did not look back. Looking back is an act of sentiment, of connection. The connection was severed. The cord had been cut thread by thread over 35 years, and I had felt the final snap that rainy Tuesday. To look back would have been to give power to a ghost. My power was in facing forward. Toward the cab. Toward the unknown. Toward the silence that was no longer an absence but a presence. My own. The revenge, if one could call it that, was absolute. It was a revenge he will never understand. It was the revenge of peace. I did not take his money. I did not turn his friends against him. I did not rage or plot. I simply stepped out of the frame of his life. I removed the cornerstone and walked away, leaving the structure to settle into its own new unstable shape. His punishment is the life he now inhabits. A life where the lights all work but the darkness is inside. A life where no one asks, why? Because no one is left to care about the answer. He is alone with the perfect functionality he always valued above all else. And I am alone in my small sunlit apartment where the only light that matters is the one I choose to turn on or off for myself. The power in the silence of leaving is that it is irrevocable. A scream fades. A tear dries. A slammed door can be reopened. But a silence that is chosen, that is nurtured, that becomes your native tongue, that is a door that locks forever from the inside. He is on the other side now, shouting questions into the void. And I am here in my quiet, finally listening to the sound of my own breath. The most powerful sound I have ever heard. It requires no explanation. It simply is. And I am. It is done, my dears. The story is told. And if you listen closely, in the quiet after the telling, you can still hear it, the low, persistent buzz of that old porch light. Not from my house, no. That light is his now. He can change the bulb to a colder, brighter one. He can leave it burning from dusk till dawn. It will never again be what it was. It will never be a promise. It will only be a utility. My light is different now. It has no switch on a wall. It has no glass to gather dust. It is quieter. It is inner. It is the soft, steady glow of a life no longer lived in the shadows of someone else's expectations. It is the warmth of a choice, finally made. For years, I thought the power was in the waiting. In the endurance. In the silent martyrdom of the lit porch. I was wrong. The power was in the sitting down. In the letting the dark come. In the listening to the sound of my own heart beating, not for his return, but simply for its own stubborn, beautiful persistence. The power was in realizing that I was not the keeper of the flame. I was the flame, and I had been letting my light spill out onto the porch for a man who preferred to stand in the dark. So I took it back. I brought my light inside. And here, in this new quiet, it is more than enough. It illuminates a world that is finally, blessedly, my own. Thank you for listening. Go in peace. And remember, my dear ones, you are not responsible for lighting every path. Sometimes, the most revolutionary thing you can do is to turn the light around, and see, for the very first time, your own magnificent face warm in its golden glow. Good night.